Test. 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 It's coming through on, so that's good. Stream is live. How do I kill audio going to the projector? That's out. Test. 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 Go blue. Every other day. I'm a Dollar Shave Club guy. I love a lot of their stuff. But it took me a while to figure out which razor is actually the best razor to use. Like the triple, the quad, or like figure out how to live stream those.
All right. Do we know how many people are on there?
Zoom, I got 8. Yeah, it's loading.
All right, good evening. Glad everyone's finding the drinks over there. That's thing number one, is to find the drinks. Listen. That was for Rob. Rob said he couldn't hear me. All right, so welcome to our October event. Man, I was looking at the date today, and I just, like, my brain froze that we're in October already. It says like October 4th. I'm like, when is that? It's month today, so that's crazy. So thank you everyone for showing up. Tonight we are going to have a couple great presentations from XP and from Veronis. I'm looking forward to that. And we'll tell you how to get the CPE credits afterwards, because I know everyone cares about that stuff. So let's move on to the board. So again, here's our Detroit chapter board. If you see them around, Renew's over here, Arun is back there. Eric is doing a great job on the AV. He's stressing out over there, so give him a pat on the back as you go by. Rob's over there. Michael is back there digging at his ear. So anyways, all do this voluntarily, so we're here to serve you guys, especially this table right here with all the young people at it. Because again, as I say, oh, here's more over here. So as I always say, the purpose of this thing is twofold. One, increase cloud security knowledge, and we want to help build the pipeline for the next group of people coming through. So you all of you here are helping us do that, so we appreciate that. So if we go to the next slide, man, this thing is like fading in and out on me. It's crazy.
Did you reboot it?
Now I'm gonna throw it on the ground. Is this better or worse? Now I don't even hear myself. So it hears that, but it doesn't hear this. Hello? All right, there. Yikes. All right. In the midst of all that, new website. So the lady in the peach back here has been working. All right, so the lady in the peach back here has put this website together for us. So this is our first real website. We've had one for a while, but this is to revamp it and get things a little bit more organized. So go out and take a look at that. And with that, wow, this is a real fuddly beginning to this meeting, but let's bring up Scott from Exabeam and see if you can do any better with this microphone. All right, but you're going to introduce them. You got good luck with that one.
I'll just yell. So anyways, I'm Scott Turner with Exabeam. Was the first sales guy come here almost 8 years, and Andy was one of our first customers. Who's known to us as Andy at eBay. So we were just coming out of GA when they started the product to use the product at eBay. He'd been brought in while he was at KPMG to help build out their SOC after a breach. As with some of our best employees at Exabeam, he came over as an engineer, was an engineer for a few years, led our field engineering team for the last probably 4 years, and then now he's moved to product side of the house. So he develops all of our security content and detections for the SIM platform that'll be announced on the 17th, and then for our advanced analytics, which is going to be GA. That's kind of what we're doing, secret sauce web systems. So Andy's going to talk to you a little bit about what we do and the credentials, and I'll let him take it. Here, you want to hear more than
See if you try this one. It changes the signals.
All right, let's give this a go. So thank you, Scott. Now Log4j, you have the latest threat, the latest exploit, and everyone spends all the time trying to detect that. And they forget about the fact that oftentimes attackers are using the same TTPs over and over, and we're just focused on the IOC. So we're going to talk about that in the presentation today. So let me, oh.
Slides? Oh.
No, no worries.
Fix the audio stuff.
One down.
One down, one to go. There you go.
Right. Let's see. Mirror display. All right. So we're going to talk about kind of the current state of security operations and threat detection. We'll talk about the difference between IOCs and TTPs, the benefits and the challenges with each. We'll talk a little bit about what is behavior analytics and how can we leverage behavior analytics to be able to catch very complex attacks and be able to catch different types of attacks from different threat actors using behavior. So current state of security operations. So for most organizations, kind of the lifeblood of the SOC is the SIM, right? This is where we're pumping most of our security logs and detections into. And the SIM offers us some capabilities to correlate and build new detections that we're not getting from an individual point solution. And we have kind of two options with these correlations. One is a simple single event match. Like if I see Mimikatz running on a server, I want an alert right away, right? Send that to somebody to go look at. And if I want to build something a little bit more complex, I can actually correlate different events together. But either way, when I'm doing this, I kind of have to know what I'm looking for. I kind of need to predict how I'm going to be attacked. I may say, hey, if this proof point alert comes and I get a malware alert or a firewall alert, and that rule will only fire if those things happen in the relative time frame and in that order. And this has always been the challenge. How do we stay ahead of the attackers and try to predict how they're going to operate within an environment? Now, outside of the SIM, a lot of us use store technology, something to help automate all of these noisy alerts, right? Not every alert that comes out of my SIM is high fidelity. So I want to put a process in to automate some of these things, reduce the challenges of my L1s, and usually what we do in the SOAR is really add context. We're using it to enrich a case. We're using it to look at when this alert fires, is there any sort of known compromise or IOC around this? But again, in the end, both of these solutions are oftentimes very much focused on the indicator of a compromise, something that's already known, something that's already been discovered. And this is kind of the challenge where we continue to kind of chase our tails a little bit, playing whack-a-mole on these things that fire that were maybe relevant 2 weeks ago, but not that relevant today. So if we look at what is an IOC, basically it's an indicator of compromise, right? This is an observed activity on a network or an operating system that with high confidence indicates an intrusion. Now I underline the word high there because the indicator of compromise is a high degree of accuracy when it's first found, right? When someone identifies the threat and these first IOCs. But as soon as they're known and they're shared, they start to diminish in value because attackers are going to change their IOCs very quickly and very frequently. So common IOCs are AV signatures, file hashes, file names, URLs, and domains. And here's an example that I'll use throughout the presentation of a Russian threat group, just a list of some of the IOCs from one of their attacks a number of years ago. Now if we look at the evolution of IOCs, and I'm just going to build this out, not a lot has changed. We continue to buy new technologies that introduce new IOCs for us to be able to detect things. So it started with the very kind of first cybersecurity product, antivirus, in the late 80s. Very much a static, correlation-driven, signature-based approach to known files. In the early 80s, we started to connect all of our networks together. We needed visibility to that north-south traffic, so we installed firewalls. This gave us new IOCs, new IPs to detect threats, communication. Once we had kind of the perimeter and the endpoint lockdown, when we deployed network intrusion detection, that attacker gets in, what happens within my environment, in my network on the east-west side. In the early 2000s, we had the internet rising up, and so we had web proxies. And again, this gave us new IOCs, URLs, domains, IP addresses, be able to identify command and control type traffic. And then in the early 2000s, we had SIM, right? We had these four core technologies that most organizations had, generating alerts, generating logs, and bringing these all together into the SIM to try to, again, build new complex detections. And from 2010 to really now, the focus on the IOCs has been how do we share these through open IOC? How do we build them into the platforms we already have? So when IOCs are automatically detected and put into prevention of my firewall. It's all about automating the operation of those IOCs. So we're going to look at Grizzly Step, so a Russian malicious cyber group. They've been known to target governments, critical infrastructure, think tanks, universities, and political organizations. And there was a published attack for their behavior. This is all the way back in 2015 and 2016. So obviously these IOCs are likely no longer valid. But what I want to highlight is how these IOCs can be used at different phases of the kill chain to detect an attacker. And then we'll show you how you can use behavior and TTPs to do the same thing, but with a lot more breadth. So in this case, started with doing reconnaissance. They used 879 different IPs to scan organizations to look for vulnerable systems to try to exploit. Once they found those, they weaponized their exploit, which happens in the attacker space. So that's typically not something you would have a log for in your environment or be able to detect. And then they delivered this, and they used spear phishing. And so the example here is there was a specific email subject that they used that they wanted people to click on. There was an eFax. So I could look for that particular IOC in my environment to say, did anyone get an email that looked just like this subject? Maybe they were attacked by that particular threat group. Once they were in, they used a well-known exploit. And once again, if I wanted to find out, did this happen in my environment, I could look at my vulnerability management solution, see, do I have any systems that have that exploit available that is hatched, I could look for specific activities related to the exploit actually being detected. They installed malware. They used a form of onion duke. And so there's an MD5 hash that I could search for across my environment or build a correlation rule on. They used the web for command and control to a specific domain. And again, for their actions and objectives, they again use that onion duke malware to establish FTP to exfiltrate data. So as you can see, there are different points throughout the attack, different IOCs that you can use to detect this. But each one of these IOCs is very specific to this particular threat and this threat group. And these IOCs now are no longer valid, right? And so we need to find a better way to detect threat groups and attacks that aren't so specific. And that's where we can start to use behavior. Before we get into the behavior, let's talk about the IOC pyramid of pain. So some of you may be familiar with this. What the pyramid of pain is trying to do is to communicate how difficult it is for an attacker to change a specific IOC and how easy it is for a blue teamer to actually detect that particular IOC. So on the top, when you have file hashes, IPs, domains, these are easy for attackers to change. Right? They can change these in a matter of seconds. They can actually automate so that no IOC is ever used more than once in an attack. So it's easy for the attackers to change those. It's also easy for the blue teamers to detect those. It's a simple correlation rule. Now, as you move further down, you get into tools and TTPs. These are very difficult for the attackers to change. Attackers are either buying tools to attack or they're developing them themselves. And it's not easy for them to pivot and get a whole bunch of new tools. Just it's not easy for organizations to acquire a lot of new tooling every single year. Not only are it difficult to change the tools, it's difficult to change the behavior, the way they attack. They're going to continue to do the same things they typically always do. And so it's hard for the attacker to change the tooling and TTPs. And today it's difficult in a lot of cases for blue teamers to detect those TTPs because that's typically not the area of focus. So let's flip into TTPs. So what is a TTP? It's a tactic, technique, or procedure. And these are descriptive in nature, right? They're talking about the characteristics of how and what an adversary behavior is. So it's really, what are they doing and how are they doing it? And so if you're familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, this is a screenshot from the MITRE framework, which analyzes and groups all of the different TTPs that are seen in the wild. I think they're up to 367 TTPs today. The nice thing about TTPs is that they're abstracted from specific attacks. So what you'll notice is that a single TTP is going to be used in multiple different attacks by multiple different threat groups. And so by focusing on the TTPs, you have a lot smaller surface area to focus on instead of chasing all of the IOCs. We're going to take a look at one of my favorite TTPs, which is persistence and account creation. All right, I've seen this in a number of attacks. This happened in the attack at eBay. They got credentials, they created their own domain admin account, and they basically own the entire network. But why would an attacker want to even, touch malware, right? They may not want to run the risk of AV or EDR detecting that. If they can create their own credentials and their own backdoor, they can just continue to log in, and that's what we continue to see them doing. Now, MITRE's great in that it actually gives some guidance on, if I want to detect this TTP in my network, what could I do? And it's simple. They say, log your Windows 4720 event code and perform regular audits on your domain and local system accounts to detect suspicious accounts that may have been created by an adversary. But that's really difficult to do if I only have a correlation engine, right? What does it mean to do a regular audit? Am I supposed to give a SOC analyst a report every 30 days of all the accounts that were created and they're supposed to find the suspicious one? What is suspicious? Am I looking for who's creating the account at a specific time from a location? These are all questions that an analyst would have to look at on every single account creation activity that happened in an environment to try to find a suspicious account creation that could align to this particular TTP. And so while TTPs are great, there's also a challenge with it, is that the attackers are using the same TTPs that your employees use every single day to perform their job and their functions. So you're going to see things that look like a brute force when someone resets their password or forgets it. They're going to have a bunch of failed logins. You're going to see employees leveraging RDP and PowerShell to get their job done, right? These are the same things an attacker's going to do. So how do you identify when that RDP, that PowerShell, the process discovery is actually an attacker and not an internal employee just doing their job? This is really where you need to start to use machines. What machines are great at, understanding and building baselines of normal and identifying deviations and change. And so that's really what behavior analytics is all about. It's first about understanding and knowing normal, taking all of the different signals for machines and devices and building a fingerprint or a profile. You know, where does a user typically log into? From where? What devices do they use? Where do they physically badge in? What websites do they access? Where do they browse the web or email to? All of these things can be learned by the machine. And from a device, where is the device located? What does it connect to? Does it browse to the internet? These are all things that can be learned. And when the attacker has a credential or they've owned a machine, very likely to do something that deviates from that normal behavior and that normal profile. And so this is how we can put machines to work. These are the kinds of questions an analyst often asks every time they get an alert. They're going to have those 5 or 10 questions on, is this normal? Have I seen this before? We don't need humans doing this. That's what machines are great at. Not only can it identify these anomalies, it can generate context. Machines can learn a lot about an environment and the way that it operates. It can learn what the difference is between a workstation and a server based on behavior. It can learn asset ownership based on who logs into a device the most. This is all important context to have, not just for threat detection, but also when you get to investigation and response. And these can also connect the dots. So you can pair the legacy IOC, those bad domains, those hashes, with behavior, right? Because not every single anomaly is bad. And I think that's an important aspect. You need to see the whole picture in order to understand what's really going on. So behavior analytics gives you a great place to start. It's about finding that needle in the haystack. And I mentioned abnormalities are not necessarily bad. I'm in Detroit for the first time in a couple of years. So I'm logging in to my device from a new VPN location, but I'm on the same device. I'm accessing the same email clients, doing the same type of work every day. So it's not a threat that I'm coming in from somewhere new. However, if yesterday I got some malware on my machine and now I'm popping up from a new location, that may be an indication of something suspicious or risky. So we have to take abnormalities kind of with a grain of salt and look at them more holistically to understand really what's going on. So let's take a look at that first example of Grizzly Step again, but with TTPs or behavior in mind. So rather than looking at 800 and odd different IP addresses that might be scanning my infrastructure, and likely you're getting scanned every single day, and your firewalls are doing their job by blocking those malicious traffic or exploit attempts. But you could simply look at, do I have any systems sending inbound traffic to servers from geolocations that we haven't seen before, right? Versus looking at 800 different IP addresses. On the delivery side, rather than looking at a specific email subject or sender, I may want to know, do I have any email domains sending in my organization that have never sent emails to my org before? On the exploitation side, instead of looking at a specific CVE, I may want to look at things like an abnormal number of critical window commands that are running. So again, it might not detect just one particular CVE, it could detect multiple different types of exploits. On the installation side, again, instead of looking for a specific MD5, one process, which is easy to change, I may want to look at any processes that are running in my organization for the first time, or from a new file location, or from a temp directory. On the command and control, instead of looking for a specific domain, I may want to look at any domains in a geolocation that are being communicated to, or a low-level domain that's being accessed for the very first time. And then finally, on the data transfer side, right, DLP is a very hard thing to solve, and especially exfiltration, where you have static thresholds like over 5 megabytes or 50 megabytes. By learning what is normal behavior and traffic for a machine, you can identify when it begins to send traffic to multiple different locations that's abnormal in nature. So this is a different way to look at the problem. Instead of those individual IOCs, looking at the behavior, the abnormalities that can tell a story, not just for Grizzly Step, but there are other threats that you'd be able to uncover by looking at these same types of anomalies. Now, Grizzly Step, that example is a little bit old, right? It's 5, 6 years old, but it still holds true in terms of where we are as an industry and what we typically focus on, which are those IOCs. And so if we take a look at a newer threat group, and an example, Lapsus is a great one. Obviously, we were all probably familiar with Lapsus starting kind of late last year and into this year. They had some very high-profile organizations. And I think initially everybody thought that these were a very sophisticated crime group, that they probably had a lot of 0 days, and that's how we're able to get into these organizations. But it wasn't that at all. They did what has been happening for 30 years. Dumpster divers used to gain credentials and use social engineering. That's what these guys were doing. They were simply willing to buy credentials for a couple $100s, and employees were willing to sell them. And so you have to ask yourself, what prevention tools do I have in my organization to keep these attackers out? We have MFA, which is a good prevention tool, but we continue to see that that's being compromised through MFA bombing. We'll continue as the security industry to evolve to continue to stop these types of attacks. But at the end of the day, when an attacker has credentials, they're going to get in. And so let's look at, this is a timeline that was done by Mandy and leaked during Lapsus. And this gentleman, Greg, on Twitter actually went through this timeline, and he started to point out what should organizations look at from a behavior and an anomaly detection perspective that would have helped detect Lapsus in an environment. Because with Lapsus, there wasn't a lot of traditional IOCs. They weren't deploying malware in most cases. They didn't have a bunch of command and control and network infrastructure. And so organizations were wondering, if Lapsus got in here, how would I root them out? How would I find them? So these are the kinds of things that Greg was trying to point out. One of the things that Lapsus did was use RDP to get in. So if you use RDP today, some of the questions you may want to get answers to are things like, has this user ever used RDP in my environment before, right? Likely not all of the users in your environment RDP every single day. Where is that RDP connection coming from and at what time? These are important things to be able to understand, to know, is this just normal RDP traffic or could this be a threat actor? If we look at a few others, suspicious browser activities, right? He's saying that the guys were using Bing. That was suspicious right out of the gate, which is probably true. And they were, obviously not that sophisticated. They were using Bing to figure out, how do I continue this attack? What tools should I download? But rather than looking at specific keywords in searches, you could just look for that general browser traffic that may be abnormal coming from that device or at that time, or accessing websites that would be classified as hacking through the web proxy. Those may be good indicators or things to look at. They installed and downloaded malicious tools and executed them. So here you actually do have one of those kind of legacy IOCs. You have MD5 hash. But again, it wouldn't be that difficult for them, instead of cats, to use Cobalt Strike. Do you really have all of those rules set up in your SIM to look for every little piece of malicious or known bad software that these attackers might use? Or do you simply want to look at if a process is being run out of a directory for the first time, or a process is making abnormal network communications? These are the types of things behavior analytics can bubble up. Number 4 on here, local user and account creation. So again, my favorite TTP, these guys did the exact same thing. They started to create local accounts. They started to create additional accounts on the domain to keep their persistence. Number 8, Mimikatz downloaded and executed. Again, everyone probably has their Mimikatz alert set up, but what if they don't use Mimikatz? What if they use PowerShell? And again, PowerShell is a tool that's often used by attackers, and it's probably used by your IT department every single day. So it's not just about who's running PowerShell, but what types of commands are they using in PowerShell? Are they encrypted arguments? What kind of communication is happening from those machines when PowerShell runs? Those are all great things that can be surfaced up as potential indicators of compromise. Number 8, SAM and HIV creation. Again, looking for privileged execution. Understanding, do I have users who have ever done a right-click run as in window and escalated to a higher privileged account? Has this user ever done a sudo on my Unix machines? If they haven't, that's probably something that you want to be alerted to and have some visibility into. A couple of more here. Suspicious directory created. So again, looking at not just activity and execution, but file access, file creation, file path creation, where users are actually accessing files. Are they accessing a sensitive directory? Are they accessing files that they've never accessed? Are they doing it in higher volume than they typically would? These are all also good indicators that something might be going on. We have Office 365 logins, right? So we know that there is some built-in protection with Office 365. It has its own behavior analytic, but there's other things you can look at within, not just where the user's coming from. What are they doing on Office 365? What types of configurations might they be changing? That's another really important aspect, is if an attacker has access, maybe they're shutting off the local firewall on a machine, maybe they're creating additional configurations in Office 365 to hide all of the activities that they're performing. Suspicious files accessed. Again, DLP products here, they had a specific file related to domain admins in their LastPass. Again, it'd be really hard to know that this file likely existed in a network. Somebody created this, they shouldn't have. But understanding if they're accessing a file on this machine that they normally don't, regardless of what it's called or what's in it, these are the kinds of things that we can do. Again, even more account creation and local administration, so creating local accounts. So sometimes you might have credentials that create accounts on the domain quite frequently, but they never create local accounts. So that can be a good tip-off or an indicator that something's changed or is different. And finally, email tampering, right? Whether it's business email compromise, users setting up email forwarding rules, or adding, searching an entire inbox, forwarding a whole bunch of data outbound. Again, all of these different types of things related to the behavior can be identified. So with those kind of things in mind, if Lapsus was able to get into the environment, if they were able to buy credentials, how long would it take your security team to ask and get answers to a lot of those questions? Would you even know which users to start asking and answering those questions for? If you had to figure out, did I have any user accessing my RDP abnormally in the last 30 days? How would you go find that? How long would that take, right? This is the challenge we have. We know the questions that likely we need to get answered, but it's really hard to get those answers. And this is, again, where we put machines to work to be able to identify and flag these questions and answers in real time all day long. So kind of in closing, and lastly here, if we look at the IOCs versus the TTPs, we have hundreds of millions of IOCs. They change frequently, they change within an attack itself, and this is where we primarily focus a lot of our detections. You know, when Log4j hit, I run the security research team at Exabeam, and everyone was saying, how do I detect this? How do I detect this? So we wrote a correlation rule, but people were not focused on, if it was exploited, what do I do next? What are the attackers doing once they got into my organization and exploited it? This is where oftentimes we lack visibility and understanding of those next steps. And so if we shift the focus to these TTPs, we only have to focus on trying to be able to detect 367 different behaviors. When I updated this slide a couple of years ago, it was at almost 290. 290 TTPs. So in the last couple of years, it's only grown 50, 60, right? That's a much more meaningful and a much easier thing to try to keep up with. And again, these TTPs are used across attacks and across threat groups. So if we focus on those, we can detect a lot more interesting things. And attackers don't need to change their TTPs that often because we're not focused on them. They're still successful. They're still using the same TTPs. Until we can turn the tide and force them to have to adapt, they're going to continue to use these same techniques. So we need to move our detections to TTPs and really focus on things that are consistent across attacks and attackers. Right? This is how we're going to get that leg up. IOCs are still valuable. We still want to know when these major attacks happen, but we also need to shift more of that focus onto behavior that's going to be consistent across attacks and attackers. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I was told I need to hold this mic like Eminem or Fred Durst, whatever. So are there any questions? I mean, that was a really good discussion, really in-depth for you young people. This is good stuff here. You should track this guy down and talk to him. You have any questions? All right, so we're going to take about a 10-minute break because there's all this food back here and all those plates. And so we're going to rustle those plates around for the next 10 minutes before we get going with Varonis. So at about 10 till, we'll start with Varonis. In the meantime, head back there, grab this great food, and eat up. Thanks.
Test. Test. No, yeah.
Get started here in like right now. So everyone make your way back. I think a few people out to the bar over there. All right, Andrew, you got a tough job ahead of you. You're gonna have to settle everybody down, get them all engaged again. Hey, but before Andrew comes up here from Veronis, I just want to say I'm really happy to see everyone here tonight. This is pretty impressive. We outgrew our front room after about 6 months, and it looks like we're gonna outgrow this room. So I really appreciate that. So Andrew, if you want to come up here and let's.
Hey everybody, if I could have your attention, please. Andrew Merrick from Veronis. I just want to thank the group tonight for having us here. Appreciate that. I was going to read a long bio of our guest tonight, but I'm going to let him introduce himself. But pretty special guest that we have in tonight from Veronis, all the way in from Minnesota. I'll be honest, this is one of the best speakers I've ever heard talk. So I don't want to overdo it, but this guy can really speak on data protection and data security. So please help me in welcoming Brian Vecchi, our field CTO from Veronis.
All right, we got this weird mic speed. I might just.
I don't know why that one's doing. This one seemed to work for Andrew.
This one works a little bit better. All right, that was a hell of an introduction. Heck, I'm not sure if I can live up to that. My name is Brian. I'm our field CTO. I've been at Veronis now for about 13 years. I was in IT and in security before that. I did a lot of different things and worn a lot of different hats. And these days, it's my job to talk to folks like you about who we are and what we do and where we fit in the world and kind of our view of the universe, what we're seeing, enterprises large and small, and how they deal with threats, how they protect their data. And what I want to talk to you today about is managing this tension between security and productivity. Every single CISO that I meet, I ask them a couple questions like, is your data growing? And the answer is always yes. And are you onboarding new SaaS applications and adopting the cloud? And the answer is always yes. And I always ask where on their priority list security is. And for the CISO, it's always really high at the top. And if I say, what about the board or the CIO or the CEO or the CFO, security kind of falls further down that list. We're in a rush to get to a world where everything's accessible from anywhere. We can do our jobs from anywhere. We can access data and applications on premises and in the cloud from any device. I can do my job from my phone if I wanted to. Our world is more reliant on data than it ever has been. We're now in a world where there really isn't any more perimeter. The perimeter is maybe my laptop. The perimeter is constantly changing, constantly evolving. It's harder to manage. It's even harder to control. Endpoints are a lot more like access points than data stores. These days, if I lose my laptop, it sucks. It's a pain in the butt. But the data on it is not going to cause Veronis to go out of business. We're not going to lose really anything of value. Everything's encrypted. It's really no problem. The problem if I lose my laptop is that it's an access point into data and other systems and applications that we've got on premises in the cloud. You've got my authentication keys, and you can now use what my laptop and my accounts have access to. That's the problem. Our devices are really just access points into a broader ecosystem, and the object of every security program initiative that we have is to protect data. Nobody breaks into a bank to steal the pens. They're after money. Somebody wants to get access to your network, and if somebody wants access to your network, they will get it. They're going to go after data. Maybe they're going to steal it. Maybe they're going to encrypt it. Maybe they're going to steal it, and then they're going to encrypt it and have you pay them to get the decryption keys, and then pay them again so that they don't sell it on the dark web, and then pay it again so they don't call the news to tell everybody that you've been breached. Data is really the new attack surface. We can't really reduce our attack surface. I was at a symposium where the entire theme was how to manage and reduce your attack surface, and I thought that's a bunch of bull. you cannot put that toothpaste back in the tube. The number of endpoints quadrupled in the last 4 years. You're not going to get rid of them. You're not going to take all these applications that you've now moved into the cloud and put them back on premises. The attack surface is going to continue to grow. You can try to manage it. You can try to reduce the risk to it, but you can't actually reduce it. Your attack surface is big, and it's more complicated, and it's going to continue to be, and it's going to get even worse. If you've got data, though, somebody wants it. That somebody could be an outside attacker. It could be Lapsus, like our friends at Exabeam were talking about. It could be an insider that wants to walk out the door with every single piece of information about every single one of your customers, and suddenly not a competitor that knows everything about you. If you've got data, somebody wants it, but protecting it these days is really, really tricky. It's really hard to protect data. Why? Well, if we change our thinking a little bit from the attack surface to blast radius, what would happen if my account or my device was compromised? What do I actually have access to? To answer that question, we need to know where important information is, who's got access to it, where it's exposed, and then we have to start fixing problems that we find without breaking anything. You can reduce all of your data security or information security risks down to nothing. You know the best way to do that? Delete everything. Turn off your 365 tenant. Unplug the NAS. Just get rid of everything. No more risk. But we can't do that because the data, unlike this laptop, unlike the devices, unlike the network, unlike everything that falls under our umbrella as IT and IT security professionals, the data is a business asset. I don't know what this person's data is. I don't know who's supposed to have access to it. So if I delete it or I shut off access to it, what am I going to break? My first job was in a help desk, and I encourage everybody that ever wants to work in technology to work on a help desk for at least a year. And one of the things my boss told me that I'll never forget, he said, if you want to get us in trouble, and by that I mean get you in trouble, start fixing things if you don't know what you're going to break when that happens. You start flipping switches and you don't know what's going to happen, you're going to get everybody in trouble. We're also in a world where everything is distributed. We're expected to access anything from anywhere. We're expected to collaborate internally and externally. 70% of data flows these days are initiated by an application, not by a user. And in that kind of world, what are all these people doing? What are all these applications doing? And how quickly can we detect when something goes wrong? It's one thing to see an indication of compromise and then respond. It's another thing entirely when somebody just grabs a spreadsheet that's got a bunch of really valuable information and walks out the door. Or these days, right-clicks, creates a link, and then accesses it from their personal account. So how do we lower the time it takes to detect a threat, and how do we lower the time it takes to respond to a threat? Our friends at Mandiant published a number, I think this was a few weeks ago, where they were really proud that the average dwell time for an advanced threat has gotten down from 180 days to 23 days. You give me or somebody on my security research team 23 days in your network before you know that I'm there, I will run you out of business. I will take every bit of every file, everything in your environment, I'll exfiltrate it all, and then I'll encrypt it, and you'll be paying me from now until the end of time. And we have a lot of data these days that doesn't even belong to us. It's the PII of citizens or consumers where we have a fiduciary responsibility to know who's got access to it, how it's being used, who it belongs to. We have to minimize collection. We have to delete it when we no longer need it. We need to fulfill right to know and right to forget. We need to meet compliance frameworks like SOX and HIPAA and PCI and whatever. We need to prove that the right controls are in place, the preventive controls and the detective controls and the accountability controls and the corrective controls. Now think about all these questions. Now, let's do a thought exercise. Think about one data set, your file servers, or OneDrive, or Salesforce, or S3. How hard is it to answer one of those questions of one kind of data, let alone all of those questions about all of the data that you have, especially since everything is constantly changing? And it's really hard to understand the scale of this problem. I'm going to tell a story, and I'm kind of throwing this one under the bus, but I'm not going to name her name, so I guess I'm really not. She's the chief legal operations officer for a very large manufacturing company here in the Midwest. It's not in Michigan, but not very far away. And I was talking to her about data privacy and about their environment and things that we've seen, and I asked her, you know, she's not a technologist, but she's now in charge of all of the technology that her firm uses to protect data and to keep data private. I asked her, how many shared folders do you think you have here? And she said, oh my goodness, it's got to be in the hundreds. I was like, that's a lot. Can you imagine going to each one of those folders and trying to figure out who's supposed to have access to this data, finding the stuff that's open to people who don't need it, and then trying to sit down and make a decision about who should and shouldn't have access? And she said that would be a nightmare. And then I showed her a slide, and I'm going to show you a similar slide in a little bit. I showed her a slide from her environment. Turns out she didn't have hundreds of folders. She had 400 million shared folders, and 183 million of those were open to literally every single account in the company. And her face went white, because she says, we're going to go out of business. I was like, yeah, we're going to solve the problem. But this is the scale. We don't even understand the scale of this problem. So let's play a game. Anybody know how many folders are in a single terabyte of data? I'll give you a hint. It's more than a few hundred. 4 billion? No, it's not 4 billion. It's about 80,000. About 80,000 folders. Now, how many files? So if you get 80,000 folders in 1 terabyte, and I guarantee you all of you have way more than 1 terabyte of data that you need to worry about. How many files do you think you hire someone new? She starts on day 1. She barely knows what her job is, but she's excited to start. She opens her laptop, logs in, authenticates to Active Directory. She's got a brand new account and has never asked for access to anything. How many files do you think she can access? Anyone want to venture a guess? Hundreds? Thousands? Hundreds of thousands? 50,000? 250,000? You're a new employee and you're giving them access to 250,000 files. Why would you do that? It's absurd. On average, though, the average user has access to 17 million files without ever asking access to anything. 99.999% of that data has absolutely no relevance to their job function whatsoever. And then we wonder, why is ransomware so profitable? Because all I need is one account. And if we narrow things down to just sensitive data, 31,000 files, or 12% of sensitive data, are open to literally every account on your network, and that's on average. I've seen these numbers orders of magnitude higher. And this is true whether you're a manufacturer, a hospital, a law firm, a bank, an insurance company. Everyone struggles with this because data is not a technology asset. Data is an organizational asset, and this is just how people work. So, some of you might be thinking, well, this might be true on-prem, but when I move everything to the cloud, these problems are going to go away. Sure. Let's see what this looks like. A traditional file share, IT sets up a share, then you create a security group, and you add that group to the share. There are a ton of problems with this model. This model breaks down all the time because that group can be used in a dozen different places, and lots of groups can grant access to the single share, and the everyone group can be applied there. But at least the users themselves, they can't break anything. If I want one of you to have access to my data, I don't get to pop into Active Directory and create an account for you and add it. I don't do that. I don't have that authority, nor should I, except it doesn't matter anymore. All of my data is in 365. 365 provides frictionless collaboration. I can do my job from anywhere. I can work with anybody. And that means that share button is everywhere. And I can share entire SharePoint sites. I can create and manage teams, which is just wonderful. I can share links to folders, and I can share links to files, and I can share with people inside and people outside. I can create a link that anybody can use. And I can do it from anywhere. I can do it from my phone. I can do it from the PowerPoint client. I can do it from the desktop. I can do it from a web browser. I can do it from a web browser on one of your devices as long as I've got my MFA key. So I asked another CISO when we did a risk assessment in her environment. Now, she had about 15,000 people. This was a hospital. And I asked her, how many SharePoint sites do you think you have? Now, she had 15,000 people. They had a few hundred SharePoint sites. They had just started their journey into 365, and she says, it's probably the same. It's probably a few hundred SharePoint sites. I said, really? And I brought up a slide that looked exactly like this. 15,000 people, they've got 19,825 SharePoint sites. Because what she didn't realize was every single OneDrive share is its own SharePoint site. And she had been a SharePoint administrator before, so she knew what that meant. Every single one of these has 3 groups that are created by default, members, owners, and visitors. And for all those team sites, which are also SharePoint sites, Microsoft's answer to everything, by the way, is let's just make it a SharePoint site, because that's going to fix everything. What it does is it makes it really easy for them to create the infrastructure underneath. It makes it really hard for you to know what's going on. This was only 40 terabytes of data, thousands of files being shared externally. The complexity is really, really hard to imagine. So when we think about data, wherever it is, if it's on premises, if it's in 365, if it's in a cloud app like Salesforce, if it's in object buckets like S3, a lot of us don't even know where to begin. We don't even know what we don't know. If you're a CISO or you're a security practitioner, you may have been asked by vendors or somebody else at one point, what keeps you up at night? And the #1 answer that I have heard, it's not a specific risk, or an indication of compromise. It's not a specific cyber criminal group or nation state actor. You know the number one answer that I hear? It's what I don't know about. It's the unknown unknowns. We don't even know where we're at risk because we don't even know where to look. And when we start trying to fix things, we don't understand how this data is being used really, so we don't know what we're going to break. Protections on data are generally perimeter focused. My data is protected because I've got EDR and a next generation firewall. That's really not true. Those are perimeter controls. They are not data controls. The data controls often require labels, and I could do a whole presentation on just how hard it is to get labels on files. Rest assured, if you rely on your users, it's never going to happen. You know the same person will label the same file differently depending on whether they've eaten that day or not? Because the amount of sugar in your brain will determine how much analysis you can put into making that decision. And alerts can be noisy. We're all suffering alert fatigue. And we have to go to lots of different places to figure out, put together what actually happened. So the time to detection is high and the time to response is high. So what can we do? This is the reality. What can we do? We can take a data-first approach to security. And in order to do that, we need to look at data through three particular lenses. The first is, what is it? Is it important? Is it sensitive? The second is, who's got access to it? Another way to think about that is, what's the risk? Where is data exposed? Where does it live? What entitlements or controls are giving people access to that data? And the third is usage. How is this data actually being used? The reason that all three of these dimensions or lenses are really important is if you're missing one or more of them, you can't answer any of those questions. If all you have is classification, a number of times I've heard my number one problem is I don't know where all my sensitive data is. Great, I'm gonna wave a magic wand, snap my fingers, and show you everywhere all of your sensitive data is. Now you don't have one problem, now you have 17 million problems. Because it's in places you didn't expect, accessible by people you didn't expect, being used in ways you had no idea. If all you have are logs, that can be useful, but it doesn't tell you where you're at risk. It doesn't give you context about whether that data is important or not. And if all you have are entitlements or permissions, then again, you can't prioritize risk and you can't fix anything because you don't know how this data is being used. So, first thing, monitor behavior. We're all logging. Our friends at Exabeam will absorb all kinds of logs. That's great. It's really, really useful. But are you monitoring the data? Think about what data you are monitoring and what data you're not monitoring. And then, are you combining that information with permissions and entitlement and classification so that you not only know what data is being used and what's not, but where important data might be exposed? These guys, this is one of our dashboards, these guys, 2,862 folders that have sensitive data that are open to every single account in the company. That's a problem. But how do we fix it? How do we actually reduce the blast radius? That's a pretty big blast radius. That means any account that gets compromised, anybody clicks on the wrong email, any service account gets Kerberoasted, any device gets owned. Thousands of folders where, as an attacker, I don't even need to escalate my privileges to get access to it. I could lock it down, I could steal it, I could both. So how do we reduce the blast radius? Well, you can only do this automatically because you'll never have enough headcount. I don't know anybody that's got tens of thousands of hours of security headcount laying around with nothing else to do. So if you're gonna automate it, you need to map all of these entitlements. You need to understand where all of these users and security groups and other entitlements are actually applied so that you know what you need to fix, and you need to record how the data is being used so that you'll know what you'll break when you start making changes. The flip side of that is you know who needs access, which accounts, which humans, because you know how they're actually using data. Then you need the analytics to put all that together and a change engine that will create new entitlements, apply them in the right place. The outcome is that you can start to reduce the blast radius, but you can do it automatically. You can do it by discovering where there are misconfigurations that are leading to data being exposed, and that whole thing can be automatic. You can understand who needs access because you see how data is being used, and that can be automatic. You can create entitlements, Active Directory groups, Azure Active Directory groups. You can remove or replace shared links, and that can be automatic. You can apply these permissions. An entitlement is not a permission. You need to apply it to the data store or to the container. That can be automatic. You can remove the exposure, domain users, authenticated users, groups in 365 or links in 365 that grant access. There's an object, there's an entity within Microsoft 365 called everybody but external users that gets applied when you create a group in a certain way and apply it to either a SharePoint site or a file. And then because you're monitoring behavior and you have this change engine, you can roll things back if you need to and record that all of this is happening. This is an approach that actually works. You can go through your entire environment, lock everything down, and make sure you're doing it in an intelligent way without breaking anything. And this can happen in days or weeks, not years or decades. There was a bank on Wall Street that went through an open share cleanup a few years ago. And they budgeted 18 months and a team of 20 people to do it. And after 4 years, and the team had grown to 40 people, this is a really big bank, they could afford 40 people to do this, they had gotten through 1.5% of their data. Without intelligent automation, you'll never get there. You can also automate things like retention and disposition and data quarantining. Once you're looking at data in this way, you know how it's used, where it is, what it is, you know where it's living. So now, when data ages out, pick it up, move it to a staging ground. If somebody puts something sensitive where it's not supposed to be, like their personal folders. We worked with a real estate firm, and we asked them, they were using G Drive, do you have any sensitive data in G Drive? And they said, well, we have a policy. They have a policy that says there should be no PII stored in G Drive. There's a real estate firms. They've got all of these independent contractors, all of these realtors. And we said, well, can we do a risk assessment? They said, sure. So it's tens of thousands of G Drive shares, and lo and behold, millions of mortgage applications and COVID declarations and kinds of sensitive information sitting in people's G Drive, open to everybody, because the easiest way to share it with one of your clients is just to create a link and send it to them. Do you know if you make a public link in a G Drive share, even if it's a corporate G Drive share, if it's a public link, Google indexes that data? So they had all of this PII of their clients sitting in G Drive shares that were literally being indexed by Google. They had no idea. But it's a good thing that they had a policy. So, just because you lock down data, reduce the blast radius, and just because you're scanning for sensitive information and you're putting good preventive controls in place doesn't mean that your data is not under attack. We always are. The easiest thing to say as a security vendor is it's not a matter of if, but when. Of course it is. We're all under attack. You've got data, somebody wants it. But traditionally what we do is we put controls where an attacker or a threat actor would begin. We put EDR and AV on our endpoints. Great. This thing's locked down to hell and back. Excuse my language. We have big, powerful gateways, firewalls, and we monitor the network. And then maybe we look at the configurations of servers or other network devices, and we send all of that logging somewhere. And then if we're really sophisticated, we throw either security headcount or AI at looking at all of these different sources to determine whether something goes wrong. And all of this is really useful, but it can also be really noisy. Also, nothing in here is looking at the data itself. So if security started with data, we would look at the target. That's what people are accessing. That's what they're going after. So we'd start at data itself. We'd classify it. We'd look at the entitlements, and we'd look at how people are actually using data. And then we'd take a really close look at the behaviors that people use to get access to data, like authentication through our directory servers, or VPN behavior, or DNS and web behavior, because that's really useful to detect something like intrusion or reconnaissance, command and control, exfiltration. And the way this works from a data-centric approach is you're obviously gathering lots of logs or creating them where they don't exist, because none of us are turning logs on our file level auditing on our Windows servers on. So sometimes you have to create these. But you take all these logs, but instead of just putting them into an aggregator or a data lake, and instead of trying to determine misbehavior from looking at different disparate data sets and trying to infer patterns between them, what we do is we say, all right, every event that we collect, we're going to process it and clean it up. We're going to turn it into something that is easy for you to look at and use and easy for us to analyze. This is a user accessing a file and location from these IP addresses at this time. It's much easier to look at than a text log. But then we have a lot of other information that's really valuable context here. If we look at behavior and shared group membership, we can figure out the role of that user. If we scan the file for content, we know whether that file is sensitive or not. Those IP addresses have meaning. They can tell us the device. They can tell us a geolocation. So let's add all of that information into every single event. We have some organizations that are gathering 1 billion events a week, and every single one gets processed and cleaned up like this. So now, if you're going to figure out what's normal, you could look at every user and every device and try to figure out manually what looks normal for every user and device and data, except the scale of the problem means that automation is really critical here. But when you have a single source like this, a single source of data access activity that's been enriched with the information about users' role, classification, device usage and geolocation. Now, it's not that hard to automatically build a profile that's normal for every individual user. What's normal for me is not normal for you. What I touch every day is different from what you touch every day. The device I use is different from the device that each and every one of you uses every day. So, Amy here is an executive. She usually uses this device. She usually logs in from from the US. We know who her peers are. She's got access to all kinds of customer information. Of course she does. She's an executive. You know how much of that she touches on a regular basis? Almost none of it. Now, any one of these things could change. She could start using a new device. Great. Maybe she got a new laptop. Maybe she bought a phone. Maybe she's logging in from someplace new. Impossible travel alerts. That happens all the time. She's an executive. She's always on the move. She's logging in from airport Wi-Fi and her hotspots all over the place. Maybe she accesses some kinds of data once a quarter, once a year, because she's just doing some sort of analysis. Each one of those things on their own might be completely innocuous, but you put enough of them together. She's using somebody else's device, coming from a place she's never been, accessing data she's never looked at, and a lot of it is really sensitive. Enough of that goes together and suddenly something real is going on. And this is how we generate a really small number of alerts, but these alerts have a lot of context. Maybe we saw Amy moving laterally and escalating privileges before she accessed this kind of data. Maybe her password was reset before she logged into a device that she never used, and actually it belongs to one of our IT admins. That is an example that we saw recently at one of our customers where a group of administrators, IT admins, were resetting passwords of user accounts, using those user accounts to log into their devices, and then using their credentials to go access salary files and using them in the negotiations for their raises, their annual raises. You had to put enough behaviors together to see that something went wrong. But the next question becomes, when you get an alert like this, Amy's been accessing an abnormal amount of access to sensitive data, the very next question out of probably your lips, somebody that is on your team, is going to be, what data was touched? What did she actually touch? That's the really hard question to answer, unless you're monitoring the data. Then it becomes easy. Here's everything she touched. Here's everything else that device touched. Did she touch anything on premises? Did she touch anything in 365? Did she access any email websites? Did we see a DNS tunnel or a web tunnel after she accessed that data? When we saw the impossible travel, did she touch anything sensitive after it? If you're monitoring the data, these questions become almost trivial, and your recovery, your response, your investigation times go way, way, way down. During Sunburst, we have an incident response that's totally free for our customers. And during Sunburst and SolarWinds, we were on a lot of these calls, and there was a lot of Mandiant people on those calls too. And one of the Mandiant guys said, and I'll never forget this, he said, it's really interesting. When we get called in, the first question somebody asks is, okay, what was stolen? What was touched? What was exfiltrated? In that case, it was a lot of intellectual property. And what they said was, when Varonis is there, just go ask them. They'll tell you. If you're not there, we're there for a month, because the best we can do is maybe show you that an account may be authenticated to this device, but we can't tell you what data was actually touched. Maybe we can see a large amount of data being exfiltrated, but we can't tell you actually what it was, because they encrypted their tunnels, and we can't actually inspect that traffic. So if we were going to take security from a data-first approach, if we started with data, what would it look like? We'd know that only the right people could access only what they were supposed to access. We'd know who data belongs to. We wouldn't leave data open to just everybody, assuming that nobody's going to do something wrong. We'd know that just because somebody has access and is accessing data, that their behavior isn't always safe. If somebody started using my account to encrypt data, you want to shut it down, even though I have legitimate access to that data. And we know what data is most important, and we know where it's at risk, and we'd be able to prioritize it. Here's what we do. This is how we approach this problem. The left is the where. You got to look at collaborative stores on premises and increasingly in the cloud, 365, Salesforce, S3, Jira, Slack. These are places where this kind of data lives. GitHub, the number of tokens and digital secrets is crazy. Nobody ever gets rid of this stuff. Then is the what. What do you look at? You look at sensitivity, you look at entitlements and permissions, and you look at usage. And then if you've got the framework to go back and make changes, the outcomes are that data is better protected, your response and resolution times for digital threats or security threats go way, way down. And when you do all that well, it turns out keeping data private is a whole lot easier, and it's much easier to prove that you're compliant. Here's what the outcome actually looks like. One of the things that we do with all of our customers, and it's really useful for us, it's really useful for me to see how they go through this journey. But we sit down every quarter, and we say, all right, What does your environment look like? What does the blast radius look like? Why did we partner together? And are we reaching these outcomes? Here's an example from one of our customers, 20,000 accounts. So it was about 12, 13,000 people because they had lots of service accounts too, lots of computer accounts registered on the domain, about half a petabyte of data. And you can half a petabyte of data, 60 million folders, half a billion files, a billion permissions entries. You will never, ever, ever, ever have enough time to go review a billion permissions entries. This is just the complexity. This doesn't change. This is just their attack surface. But they were able to prove, and this is what they took to the board, they were able to prove that while they had lots of very sensitive information that of course made its way into files, because data is like life in Jurassic Park, it finds a way. You can have all the policies you want. In this data review, there's another CISO, she stopped the meeting, she said, why is there 150,000 credit card numbers in that person's OneDrive? Because it was one spreadsheet that they had done an analysis on and saved it to their OneDrive. She said, we have like half a dozen different policies that says you're not supposed to do that. I was like, policies don't protect your data. This protects your data. You can see how long this took. 698,000 folders that were open to literally every single account. In December of last year, they started the process. By March, it was basically done. And it's like mowing your lawn. You just go through and just keep doing it. And then from a behavior and a threat detection standpoint, almost 250 million events every month. They got about 6 alerts a day. They were able to triage and prioritize. They send those alerts off to their SIM. Some of them, they set up automatic responses, like for ransomware. You see a ransomware note that just got created, shut that account down. Don't wait for somebody to get an email. Shut it down so that not only is your response time faster, your recovery time is much faster. You know how much easier it is to recover from ransomware if it's 25 files or 250 files rather than your entire Isilon? Ask me how I know. It's much, much faster when you can respond quickly. All of this is in service of protecting our data. That's why we do all this. If you don't have any data, you don't have any risk. But of course, we all have a lot of data. And if we take a data-first approach, we can really manage that tension between productivity and security. Because we can't let our capacity to create data, and boy, do we have a capacity to create data. It can't outrun our ability to protect it. But a lot of the tools and techniques that we've been using for 20 years to try to protect data, which made sense when we had a single file server and there really wasn't anything important on it, that's not the case anymore. Again, 70% of data flows these days are initiated by applications because every single one of these SaaS applications that we use has their own configuration stack. Everything is built for collaboration by default, and they're all connected together with APIs. If you don't go through a data-first approach to protecting your data, I guarantee you're going to regret it, because at some point, you're going to find out that there's a lot more risk there than you ever realized. And I think I'm done now. So thank you all very much. I hope I lived up to Andrew's billing, but thanks for your attention. I hope this was useful.
All right, thank you. So for you young guys, what you just went through for the last hour and a half is what a CISO does about 100 times a year. So if you think that's glamorous, now you know what it looks like. Yeah, so that was great. Did everyone get all the food they need? There's plenty of food back there still. And I'm glad you guys hung in there with us. The slide. Yeah, I just want everyone to look at Eric. Look at Eric over here. And just say thank you, Eric, for putting up with this, because you don't know how stressful this is. That's a new box. That box on the table is new. This is our first time. We're kind of like road testing it live. So Eric is doing a great job. All right, so if I'm assuming everyone in this room is following us on LinkedIn, that's how you ended up here tonight. So you guys get the problem. But you need to tell your friends and family to join our LinkedIn group. And if you want CPE credits, right there, Renew, she has your CPE credits for you. If you give her $5, we'll give you your CPE credits. And that's it. So thanks for coming out here tonight. I appreciate it. I'm really stoked at how full this room is. This is awesome. We are definitely going to get a bigger room here soon. So this is great. And then We were on Zoom, but I think we're going to change our platform for live streaming in the future. We're just going to do it through LinkedIn. Makes it even more important to be part of our LinkedIn group because we're probably going to start streaming this through LinkedIn instead of Zoom. So that's cool. That's it. Thanks for showing up.